I'm Joel Baird, the General Manager of Missoula Community Access Television. We're pleased to invite you to a program, a conversation with former NEA Chair Frank Hodsoll in the MCAT studios. This is kind of one of the inaugural efforts of our general purpose room, which we call the Cat Box. And we've invited some students from the University of Montana to have a conversation with Mr. Hodsoll. I'd like to introduce Frank Hodsoll immediately to my left and ask the other people in the room to introduce themselves to start this conversation. We'll start maybe on the far end.
On the far end, on the far left, Mark Martin. I'm with the Missoula Cultural Council, and I'll pass it on now.
My name's Brian Lofick, and I work with the Montana World Affairs Council.
My name's Eric Harris, and I'm a third-year law student.
My name is Frank Hodsoll, and I've already been introduced.
Joel Baird, you remember me.
My name is Paul Sullivan. I'm a junior at the University of Montana studying philosophy.
I'm Meredith Treholt, and I'm a freshman at the University of Montana.
Ty Lundman, also a freshman at the University of Montana studying physics.
Okay, I'm going to help out now. I imagine people here would have some issues they would like to discuss. And so I'm going to throw it off to the first person that has a question.
Well, what do you think so far, Frank? We've kept this man on the go. He was on television this morning at 5 minutes after 6. He did a speech last night at the University of Montana. And then he attended a class, gave a talk to a high school class at Sentinel High School. He delivered the keynote speech this noon at our luncheon when we observed National Arts and Humanities Month. And then he rushed off to the university again and did he taped a segment of Collegium Medicum, a program that appears on Sunday morning radio, and then did another interview, I understand, with KUFM. So he has not been idle while he's been here, and it ain't over yet.
That's certainly what I might just say. I don't know what do I think. Lord knows that's one of the broadest questions. I guess I could say almost anything. But I just like to say, since we're on public access television, what extraordinary hosts and local leaders you have in what I call the two Marks now. In Mark Martin of the Missoula Cultural Council and Mark Johnson of the World Affairs Council. Not so much because they brought me here, but because of their commitment to having a variety of people come to Missoula and interact with you all in the community on a variety of subjects. And when they do that, they make sure that the people that they bring, as has just been explained, don't stop until they've unturned as many stones as is conceivable. Well, I'll just start off by and then hopefully we'll open up. I'm happy to talk either about the international situation and the degree to which culture and civilization are a part of some of the conflicts that are out there, which was the subject that I talked a little bit about last night, or to talk about, which is really the other side of the same coin, how culture can bring communities together. It's not just about divisions, it's also about bringing together. And in both cases, it's not the only thing that either divides or brings together. It is one of the things, and but important in both cases. So with that broad thing, we can talk about anything you like. Who wants to start?
I would, if I may. Last night, you described America as the world's cultural leader. Basically, I agree with you on that, but considering that much of the world does view us as producing Baywatch, as you used as your example, what criteria would you use to determine that we are the cultural leader?
I think when I say cultural leader, it has nothing to do with quality. Though there's a lot of quality in what we produce, not everything. I'm not a big fan of Baywatch, no, that's a different issue. But I say cultural leader because more people want to look at, listen to, read American stuff than any other single kind of stuff. That is not to say cultural stuff. That is not to say that people don't read French novels or Chinese poetry or whatever. But it is to say that, if you will, the Nielsen and Arbitron ratings for the world show a dominance of American culture of all kinds, not just Baywatch, internationally. The interesting thing since we live in the world that we do, is that roughly half of the major entertainment conglomerates that produce this stuff are foreign owned. They're not U.S. owned. So Fox is Australian, Sony is Universal is Japanese, Vivendi is French, and so on. So nonetheless, the creative side of all of this stuff is in Los Angeles and New York and Nashville and places like that, and other places around the country. That's on the commercial side. On the not-for-profit side, it's all over. So that's what I meant there. And a lot of that stuff, even our commercial stuff, is very, very good. It's not all Baywatch. And so there are people around the world that view us as, if not the leader, the predominant factor in culture. And I'm going to go broader than the arts. McDonald's, KFC, Walmart, they're everywhere. And again, you can like it or you can not like it. That's not the point I'm making. But the point I am making is that consumers, it's not forced on anybody, consumers seem to like that, even while they may criticize it.
Some countries seem to dislike the American influence on their culture. Even, okay, we have this, we're a cultural leader, so we kind of have this power, and we don't always consciously use it. If we were to use it more deliberately, how would countries that already dislike us perceive that, do you think?
Well, I think that if you would use it more deliberately in counterproductive ways, they'd like it less. So I'll have to describe counterproductive and productive. If we were to use it more in productive ways. In productive, I'll come to counterproductive in a minute. If we were to use it more in productive ways, in my own view, we would help those things that the marketplace does not regularly transmit abroad, like little jazz groups and chamber groups, independent films, documentaries, books that are not part of the bestseller list, etc. That we would make an effort to get some of those things out in a deliberate fashion to show the extraordinary variety of American expression that is all accommodated within these United States of America. There are many countries where you can't have all that stuff going on. They simply stop it. They say, you're not doing any more of that, and so on. And so we're unique in many ways. And other Western countries also have that kind of freedom. But our culture, and again, in the productive sense, is the way I look at it, as one arrow in a quiver, is to show people that, hey, we tolerate an awful lot of difference, and some of it's very good, and it is different. It isn't all Baywatch, to say the least, etc. Now, in a counterproductive way, I could see an effort by, it'd have to be, it wouldn't be the government, by American companies to essentially, buy up where they're not government owned and controlled, private companies everywhere, and just refuse to allow any product other than Baywatch or something of that name, or it could be something else, doesn't have to be just Baywatch, to be shown. I don't think that's a risk. I do think there's a risk that we will do precious little, and therefore, whatever the hits are, and people will go to see it, and there will be revenues from that to the extent that people don't pirate it, because there's copyright issues in some of these things. So that's essentially what I think on that. I also, if I could just add one more thing, and then I'll stop on this subject. I also think that there's a lot more made of how people generally in other countries dislike, our pop hits and so on. I don't think that's true, because they're a major source of revenue for the entertainment companies, and people aren't forced to buy the tickets. Just like you and I and our friends aren't forced to buy the tickets to go to things here. There's an appeal to some of this, and it's not brand new. If you go back to the turn of the, now I've got to say, the 19th and the 20th century, because we just had another turn of century, there was something called the dime novel. And those dime novels were largely, pulp, they were called. They were not great stuff, but people liked them. The the romance novels and so on. People bought them, and it was sort of like soap operas. I remember when I grew up on radio, there was somebody called Helen Hunt. You're all too young to know about Helen, and somebody's nodding over there. And my mother used to listen to it, and I listened to it, and it was just absolute garbage. But it was, it would kind of put you to sleep and so on at 10 o'clock in the morning, and you could not do your homework or something. That stuff exists and has always existed. American producers, sometimes controlled by other kinds of companies, are particularly good at producing that stuff. I'm now going to veer around because this is kind of an interesting anecdote. I once had an enormous argument at the beginning of my career at the National Endowment for the Arts with a guy by the name, I'm going to forget it, he was the French Minister of Culture at the time.
Jack Lang.
Thank you, Jack Lang. I shouldn't forget his name. I was sent down to Cancun. There was a big cultural conference, and he accused the United States, this was in 1981, or 80, so anyways, back then, 81. He accused the United States of cultural imperialism, and made a really quite unfriendly speech about it. I made, when it was my turn, some of the same points that I've just made to you. Hey, French people buy this stuff. We're not forcing them to buy this stuff. And after the argument went on, it became clear to me, these are not his words, these are my words, but this, I think, was the bottom line. He wanted to make sure that the French television industry could produce its own schlock and not just be swamped by the, the marketing and productive genius of our schlock producers. Another example, again from the past period, but I was sort of in this game at one point in that sense. Canadians, big conference in Canada. Canadians are particularly sensitive about all of this because most of their population lives within broadcast, not satellite, but broadcast distance from our northern tier, and our television stations are there. The Canadians want our television stations. They listen to our stuff. They don't listen to Canadian broadcasting. Not because Canadian broadcasting is worse as a matter of quality. In fact, in my judgment, it's a lot better as a matter of quality than a lot of our broadcasts, but because they just sort of like that stuff. One of the Canadians said something, this is a little different than Jacques Lang, that I've never forgotten. He said, let me tell you something. How would you feel about it if the only cop shows on your television were about the Canadian Mounties instead of the FBI? And I said, I hadn't thought about it. Actually, there was a cop show about the Canadian Mounties that had a short period on television later. But I got his point. And the point is that because American shows are about American things and institutions, it makes young people or other kinds of people in those other countries feel, well, none of our stuff matters. And we need to be sensitive to that as Americans and as governments and as a matter of public policy. It's unlikely that the commercial businesses are going to be sensitive. The prime market is America, but that's also changing because in movies now, most of your movie studios have discovered, first of all, the big profits are not made by tickets of going to the movies. The big profits are made by aftermarket sales of videos, now DVDs, used to be VHS, and the like. And on most of your hits, over half of those revenues come from abroad. So the American market is less than half. But whether it's about Mounties or FBI, they're selling, and that's happening. But it seems to me it's in the national interest to have more, and that's why we're going to need subsidy to have other kinds of things out there. So that's, anyway, I don't know, we were going around in a circle, but
If I could interject, along those same lines, it's been suggested that the current U.S. foreign policy proposal is to proactively seek more democracy and more freedom throughout the world. And there are those that are suggesting that this is actually a form of advertisement of our governance. And based on the comments you just said, it seems that you're suggesting that people have a choice to decide whether they want to watch Baywatch or whether they don't.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering, legally, socially, ethically, what rights do these countries have to say, we appreciate your concepts of governance, but thanks but no thanks?
Oh, they absolutely have the right to say thanks, but no thanks. There's no question. I mean, any country can do, whether it's on Baywatch or, we don't want a free judicial system, or, we don't like free markets, or we're going to lock people up without trial, or anything, you name it, whatever it turns out to be. The problem is that for them and for us, first for them, as follows. For them, the problem is that, and I'm not saying the American system is perfect, but the American system, which is now largely the French, British, a lot of other people's systems, Australian, and let's get out of here, South Korea, Japan, Malaysia, parts of scratch Indonesia for the moment, used to be Indonesia, Singapore, which is a bit of a dictatorship, India, now Bangladesh. I mean, amazing what's happening in Bangladesh. Anyway, there are a lot of other countries that in different, Tunisia, if I keep thinking, I'll come up with more, that are making economic progress in the sense, and I like to put it that the boats are rising. I mean, there's still poor people and they're very rich people, but the whole thing is rising. There's less poverty than you were before. I like the question, are you better off today than you were 10 years ago, 20 years ago? And there's a whole bunch of countries now, Mexico, I can keep Brazil, not Argentina, Chile. They're better off than they were before. And by and large, in different ways, all of those countries are by and large using Western concepts. Not because they came out of the West, but because democracy, free markets, and civil society, and you can have some other names, but those are, come to my mind, really help people move forward. They have to have regulation. A free market without some regulation in the public interest is dreadful. Teddy Roosevelt showed that when he created antitrust laws with the Congress at the time and so on. You can't have total freedom, but there has to be a balance. But nonetheless, the countries that have gone somewhat in different ways based on their own cultures and so on in this direction are doing a hell of a lot better than, I like to use the comment, look at Korea, South Korea, in the 1950s, and Egypt. They were about the same in terms of per capita GDP. Today, South Korea has 20 times the per capita GDP of Egypt, and Korea is sort of a democracy, it's sort of free markets, it sort of has civil society, and Egypt's a dictatorship. I'm not picking on the Egyptians here versus the Koreans, but what I am saying, there's just lots of examples like that. It's not just the United States. And so if that indeed is the evidence, I mean, to the extent that we know it, I'm not saying there may not be some new system that somebody's going to invent, but I'm going to come back to ancient philosophy. Somebody here is a philosophy. You're a philosophy major. But I'm talking to me about the Greeks. But if that's the evidence today, it has to be in their interest to want to have people better off and, somewhat free, be able to choose their own leaders. And, if they want to watch Baywatch, that's their business, but, and so on and so forth. So I would argue that America's role is in our interest to make this case, and then they get to choose, and they're going to have their own wrinkles on, this sort of thing that I'm talking about. But they get to choose. Let me now go back to Plato. Plato was a guy who, unlike Socrates and Aristotle, felt that there was an ideal state. And he talked about philosopher kings. But Plato also said, and Aristotle picked up on it, that often when you have a philosopher king, this is a benign, absolute power individual, are often followed by tyrants. And they are, because the human condition is such. Just look at the Chinese dynasties of emperors, including the Chinese Communist Party. But the human condition is such that you may have an absolutely extraordinary person who makes a huge difference. And you say to we need those sorts of people. And maybe they have very substantial powers, more than in a democracy we would like them to have. Certainly Abraham Lincoln had powers that you wouldn't believe that he put in place at the beginning of the Civil War. But by and large, we don't do that. And there was an Alien Sedition Act, if you go back to John Adams and so on. But the point I'm making is simply this, that on a political basis, the human societies that we've seen historically seem to be better off if you have choices to go back and forth. They're muddier, they take more time, they don't always do the right thing. As Churchill said, the worst system until you look at the alternative. So I'm obviously a believer that these kinds of ingredients are very important to making progress. If somebody can prove me wrong, I'm happy for that to happen. But the historical evidence seems to be in that direction to date, and my own guess, probably that's the way it is.
Well, just to follow up on
Sure.
that, one of the concerns there seems to be is that it's almost being suggested that there is a duty, or even a moral duty, a moral right the United States has to rid the world of terror. And thus, the way to do that is to fervently advance the concepts of democracy and freedom. Now, not to underestimate the power of democracy or freedom. I think we would all agree those are very sound principles. Nonetheless, the problem seems to be that, well, okay, let's just fast forward and say we have democratized and we have
We won't
pursued
have
this
done
freedom.
this, it'll be
Right.
they who have done it.
They,
Otherwise it
correct.
doesn't work. All we can do is say, hey, it's a good idea. Here's how you do it.
There seems to be a lack of evidence that terror, evil, and poverty will still exist. And when we have elements of those
In our own country.
problems, exactly.
I mean, look at Tim McVeigh. He certainly wasn't a Middle Easterner. He was part of the Oklahoma bomber guy.
So do you think we should justify this proactive approach within the confines of the war on terrorism, or should we clearly segment that and call it what it is?
Well, let me ask you a question and call it what it is. What is it in your opinion, so I can come
Well,
back?
I think calling it what it is allowing individuals, especially individuals within the relevant countries, to decide for themselves.
Oh, I see. Well, we have to allow individuals within relevant countries to decide for themselves. We can't impose, our values, and we don't have enough power to do that, even if we tried. We did a little bit after World War II say, hey, you're not going to have a Hitler from now on. You're not going to have a Mussolini, and so on. And we let the emperor stay in Tokyo, but we said you're not going to have a military junta, and we tried for war crimes, a lot of those folks. But anyhow, so in the way that was, but as a practical matter, we're not in a position to do that. We had a lot of influence in helping the Afghans pick Hamid Karzai, who was an international visitor here and went to a university here at one point. And that was the end of it. But basically, we can't do that. All we can do, it seems to me, and nor should we do that. I think it would be counterproductive. I think all we can do is to encourage people in those countries, X, Y, Z, whoever they are, to look at the evidence. And some of those people agree that, we want to try and have civil institutions, et cetera, democracy and freedom. And empower them in the sense of giving them information. I might even give them some money for textbooks for schools or something like that, or help with the schools to make their own choices and move, hopefully, in their own directions. And we've done that in a number of areas, and it's worked. In some other areas, it hasn't worked. I would argue that in Latin America, there used to be a huge number of dictatorships, colonels everywhere, running things, and locking people up or worse. That isn't the case anymore. And part of the reason for that not being the case anymore, part of the reason, not all of the reason, is a fairly active program of doing what I just said. I think we have to do that in the Middle East. We've done less of that. I think it's long-term. It's not short-term. There are going to be no immediate victories. There are still going to be terrorists, both in our country and elsewhere. But we need, it seems to me, to reduce the risk of terrorism, make it less hospitable for people like bin Laden to take over countries, to create enough of an opposition of that in other countries. And America has to be very careful that we don't get any credit for this. That that other people are doing that And it is in our interest, however, that not only do we not get credit, which would be counterproductive, be like somebody coming and telling us that we're going to do X, Y, Z, but it is in our interest that countries move in this direction. It's not just political and military, it is also economic. The majority of our exports go to the developing world. We have an economic interest. We also get a lot of resources, certainly from the oil countries and others from some parts of this world. It's in our interest that these countries move in a particular direction. And in the Middle East, as between Israel and Palestine, it is also in our interest because we are deeply politically on all sides of the political spectrum committed to maintaining a free state in Israel, even though Israel doesn't do very nice things on occasion. It's in our interest to see a Palestinian Authority, or whatever you call it, that reforms, that has, the ability to do some of these things and control terror. Now, part of this one last comment, which almost cuts somewhat in a different direction, though it's still in our interest. The countries that have a lot of things have a bigger, I'm not sure that's right. No, I'm not going to say it. It's not right. I'll stop.
I'll let you off with a question that was coming in my mind as you were talking. And that is, I suppose, if you were to measure what level you felt that art and politics were together, because often you might find people, and maybe they'd be Marxists, that would say that art and politics are fused together or ought to be. And in listening to you talk, I'm thinking, here's a man who believes that culture and politics are very closely aligned, but I don't know if that's the case, where you'd almost say the byproduct of democracy is an alluring culture, and this alluring culture is going to further the cause of democracy and winning hearts and minds all over the globe. And I don't know if I've summarized it.
That's fair, but in my view, an alluring culture is a culture that also criticizes itself and criticizes the governments that are involved with it. We have plenty of criticism going on in the arts world, of whether it's this administration or the past administration, the military, or education, or whatever you like. I think it's very telling, and I've had people say this to me abroad, that all this stuff goes on, and nobody in power is saying out with the rifles and off with their heads. And the fact that they criticize us in public and we don't mind, I mean, you always mind, but I won't say it'd be nice if nobody criticized you, but is a very telling statement. Because you can't do that in Egypt, okay? And Egypt's one of our allies. You absolutely cannot. It will be off with your head. You will disappear. So I think I think one of the great strengths of our system is a very pluralistic one in which all kinds of things go on. And you and I can disagree as to what we like or don't like about this or that aspect of it. But I'm for all of that stuff being available. Now, if I'm sitting in a government hat and saying I want to influence hearts and minds, I'm obviously going to try and pick a selection of that will have both criticism and the other. Certainly Voice of America did this during the Cold War, in a way that slants it a little bit towards a positive image. But heck, everybody does that. I mean, that's not evil. It's a little different. But I think bottom line, it's the example of pluralism and our capacity to absorb cultures that makes us an extraordinarily powerful, and I'm not talking politically, not economically so much, but it has an economic part to it. It's an extraordinary time. I mean, look, I had when I was at the Western States Arts Federation retreat 3 years ago, we had there a professor from the University of Zagreb, Croatia. Zagreb, yes, I think it is. It's not a part of the world that I have in my head every minute. And he was talking about, how they were basically a European nation, but there were these deep-seated sort of things. And people went back to the 13th century and said, I want to kill everybody who was on one side, including killing Muslims. We had this discussion. Actually, there's another person on the other side of me who had a different piece of it. My point was that one of the great attractions of this country is our ability to absorb all these things and have both many strands and a melting pot without having wars. The Civil War was a little bit of a cultural war as well as another kind of war, but after that, we've done most of it, not all of it, but most of it peacefully, and they fought wars. Interesting, there was a guy who's the fellow at the Rockefeller Foundation, Roberto Bedoya, I think his name is, who said, Frank, you're absolutely wrong. There is no melting pot here. There shouldn't be a melting pot. And I said, well, I didn't say melting pot. I said many strands and a melting pot. Because, but he and I sort of disagree. He wants to keep, he's sort of like Alan Lomax. He wants to keep everything pure, all the strands pure. But that's not real. I mean, one, I don't think it's desirable. And two, it's not realistic because there's constant interaction. American English ain't the same as Chaucer's English. Now, is that dreadful? Does that mean that we bastardize the whole damn thing? The French Academy used to complain rigorously about how the French language used things like hamburger, or hamburger, I guess. I can't pronounce it properly there. You know, and other, you know, Americanisms because it wasn't French. Well, yeah, okay, you can. There are some people who can huff and puff about things like that, but you know, the human condition moves on. Absorb some things, lose some others. Some things you regret that you lose, some things you're glad you lose. Other things you hate that you gain, and other things you're glad that you gain. That to me is just the way it is.
Assuming that America is the highest culture in the world, what, if any...
I don't want to say that, but I'll let you say it. I think we've got a pretty good system. No, that's all right. That's
I was
okay.
trying to repeat what you said.
No,
and messed it up. But what, if any, responsibility does that put on the people who produce our media, our arts?
That's a very good question. The commercial people who produce, you know, what they produce, some of which is very good, all of which is technically good, all of which has fairly good production values, are in a business. They're selling soap. They're selling whatever they're selling. And so they're going to try to make money, and they often make terrible judgments on what they make money. And most of the stuff that is produced either for television or for movies or to pop music loses money. The vast majority of it loses money. 90% of all television programs are pulled off the air if they ever get on the air after all the production costs have been sunk. Only 10% survive, and of the 10%, only about 3%, these are all out of variety and so on, actually go on and really make money. Those make a lot of money, I mean, huge amounts of money. The entertainment industry is about that. They got stockholders. They're like, you know, people who make aluminum or laptops or whatever. I mean, that's what they do. They have shareholders and so on. Occasionally, they will do some things at the edges of a public interest nature or for marketing and so on, but that's basically what they do. And that is why there is a need, either through private philanthropy or for government, you know, funding, whether it's the National Endowment for the Arts or, you know, Corporation for Public Broadcasting or whoever it is, to have some subsidy to tilt some of this stuff that doesn't make it in the marketplace, either from the past or the present, and make it available, because not the marketplace won't work for everything. It won't work for everything in any field, whether it's culture or something else. And so we need to have that, and that's why I'm in favor of the National Endowment for the Arts, the Missouri Arts Council, the Missoula Cultural Council, and other groups like that help with this. And that's why I'm in favor of the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, and Exxon when they do stuff that's good like this, and all the individuals, which is the lion's share of subsidy for, provide tax deductible contributions to this, that, or the other thing. And I think that, again, there's always balance in these things. I think that, again, a system that allows all of those things to happen, with a lot of people arguing there ought to be more money for this and less money for that, or whatever it is probably more or less right. Does that mean I'm totally satisfied with the way it works now? Absolutely not. I would like to get major studios to think about smaller, but I did a major article that I wrote up in the latest Journal of Arts Management, Law in JAMALS, Law and Society, whatever the heck JAMALS means, Journal on Arts Management, Law and Society, there we go. And in which I did an analysis of the marketplace of, I called it cultural transactions. Actually, a guy at Harvard had written a book, he sort of beat me to the punch, but we're roughly on the same page, so I feel I was more or less right, and I did some interviews that he hadn't done, and he had some statistics that I didn't do. And that is that the marketplace favors known quantities, whether they be stars or products that they think can be replicated. And it's very wary about getting to new stuff or old stuff that hasn't been done in a while. And that means that, there's a lot of jazz, for example, that's old stuff, that has great difficulty being preserved, and yet, talk about public diplomacy, that has enormous suasion abroad, and in Tehran, for example. I saw a study on that the other day. So we need to continually make efforts and do better about helping some of that stuff to survive and be out there culturally, and not just because it's in our national interest, but because those things are important. I'll give you another example from the popular culture. Bill Ivey was here, so I'll just take a page, and he's stronger and more expert on this than I am. And I went down to Nashville before he was chair of the arts, actually, to interview a bunch of people in the Nashville music business. That's where country music gets produced, in Nashville. It so happened that I was down there the day after the Country Music Awards were on television. And I'd come in the night before, so I was in my hotel room, and I thought, well, I better look at the Country Music Awards. And it was all like 70s rock. It was soft rock. And, Garth Brooks used to be pretty good, but he wasn't that great on that occasion. He won an award, or he actually didn't go, he didn't want an award. But, it was soft rock. And they did have a couple of Heritage Awards to Hank Williams and so on. Any event, the next night, but that's what the system was produced. And I met the guy who's the head of Warner Brothers Records, who does the Nashville piece for Warner Brothers. He has Reba McEntire, who's really good. Popularized. And they took me out to something called the Blue Note, which is out in a nondescript suburb of Nashville, where a lot of the old-timers came in, and also some young people. And the country music that was being played there, you wouldn't believe it was so good. Now, maybe none of you likes country music. My taste may be viewed as now as highly suspect. I think country music is a great American invention. And some of the early stories of the coal miners and so on in country music are sheer poetry. And they're quintessentially American. They're every bit as much American. Of course, bluegrass gets into that, Bill Monroe and so on and so forth. The reason I'm saying all of this is that the industry has headed, and they're very smart, cultured people in that industry. They're not, just rug merchants. But they have a job to do. And some of this other stuff is getting neglected, and Bill and I both talked about, how can we take some of this other stuff, which is extremely listenable to, and get it out there, and so on. So this is just, I'm not talking public diplomacy now, I'm just talking, we have a continuing battle to keep the best of that stuff alive.
In this continuing battle, and I very much agree with the difference between, as you said, hits and what we find down the road a few miles. If we are to push culture beyond American boundaries, for whatever reason, for what reason can we believe that what you describe as good, quintessential, really high quality culture is going to win out against that sort of homogenized, all-encompassing, absorbing culture that seems to be in the lead so far?
I don't think it's going to win out. I wouldn't, that would be more than I would imagine. I think what we can do is making sure that it's there and available and marketed to a degree. It won't be totally marketed. The internet helps because you can establish the equivalent of chat rooms in music or dance or other things where that the not-for-profit community needs to learn a lot to do that. We've gotten another little initiative going to try and help people figure out how to do that and establish it. It's very difficult. It's not easy. But I think that I guess the following things. First of all, in school, I think it's very important to have what I would call real arts education as a part of the curriculum. That not only teaches the kids who are good at playing I don't know, the trombone or whatever, to play the trombone in the football band or take a part in the school play or whatever it turns out to be, but also gives them a sense of all these things that are a part of the cultural history, not just the stuff that automatically comes in, and not just the fact that we had a political history in this country which started with George Washington before and worked its way up to George W. Bush and all the other people that were involved as well. But that also included a cultural evolution that has just a huge number of, and this gets into the humanities as well as the arts, history. That has a huge number of ingredients to it. Dan Borston, who's viewed by some as being too far to the right, did an extraordinary job of describing the American experience. And he's more on the white European side of things than maybe it should be a little bit further over. But the point that I'm making is that he and there are others who have also done that. Read some of McCullough's books, and they take snapshots of different things. Borston took the whole 9 yards and put it in 3 books some years ago. Is that you have intertwinings of political and economic and cultural progress or lack of it, or however you want to call it, of events that are really part of our history. I mean, our leaders go to church, our leaders go to concerts, our leaders listen to music, our leaders read poetry. I mean, they do it in different ways and in different fashions, but they're all influenced by this, and that's cultural. And as you look at Michael Barone, who writes these almanacs of politics, and he's more on the conservative, I tend to be slightly to the conservative side of things, I'm not hugely conservative, writes extraordinarily well about this from the Catholic's point of view, although he doesn't push the Catholicism totally. And so in schools, I would like to see this kind of broader cut that includes culture as a part of the progress of the country in relation to the world. That then, in my judgment, plus exposure to actual things, I don't know, live arts events, movies, and so on and so forth, so that I was very fortunate. I grew up with a silver spoon in my hand or mouth or whatever it was. I went to, a long time ago, I went to a school where my arts education was nothing short of extraordinary. I mean, I was a history of art major when I was at Yale, but then I went on and did other things. But I came to there as an undergraduate, with a basic sense of virtually a huge amount of Western art, most of Chinese art, and some sense of, I was very fortunate, very lucky. Most kids don't have that. At least that's my impression. It's more my impression. I know that. When you get tests, surveys that show that the majority of high school students don't know on a multiple choice basis what was the cause of the Civil War, when slavery was the only plausible answer. You have to wonder what on earth is going on. So I think that's one piece of it. The second piece of it is that you have to make, that creates in part a marketplace, though not totally. You have to make stuff that isn't on the hit list that's being marketed by the big guys available, so that people that are interested can go, whether on the internet, on television, through community access television, or other things. I'm very sad that NPR, for example, has downgraded its cultural programming in favor of talk shows, and they have. My friend Murray Horowitz, who used to head all of that, has gone over to head the American Film Institute's operation in Washington now. He just quit. But I think we need to do both those kinds of things. And then as we move abroad, if we can improve on what I've just described, then I think that's awfully powerful stuff abroad. When I went around Latin America some years ago, I just saw it in action. And I mean, people that were very antagonistic to us softened a little bit after hearing a guitar player do folk music. They didn't say that they were going to change their policies. They weren't, not overnight. But they talked to you about it, which they weren't willing to do before. And little steps at the edges helped. So.
I was wondering, when there's very basic difference in a culture, for example, I think of the United States, where women have a voice in government and many things, and then you go to...
And should.
Yes, I think so. And you go to like Saudi Arabia or Afghanistan under the Taliban, where they
Awful.
do not at all. How do you feel that cultures or countries could work through that?
I think we need to encourage, well, this has happened in Afghanistan. If you go back to, and I'm not suggesting that the king was the be-all and end-all in Afghanistan or anything like that, but you know, there were a lot of women, both in
Yes.
government and doctors and so on, and that, you know, I'm not saying women were absolutely equal, but they certainly weren't like it was under the Taliban. There's nothing in Islamic law or the Sharia, which is in either the Quran or the Sharia, which is the Islamic law, that says that women are, when I took Islamic law in England, one of the things that always struck me is that either a woman or a man could say the talaq 3 times and that was a divorce. And now, that's what is in the Sharia. That does not mean that that's permitted by governments in different parts and so on and so forth. Coming forward, there's nothing in Islam. I mean, look at Indonesia. It's Muslim, the largest Muslim country is headed by a woman. The Bangladesh has been headed by women. Pakistan, which is had a very different kind of history, has been headed by women. So there's nothing that prevents this. Iraq, as I said in my talk, I hate to say anything good about Iraq, but they're essentially secular and women are not. There are women in this dreadful, well, I don't know whether there are women in the government. Anyway, women, you know, don't have to wear veils, and they're out on the streets and they have businesses and so on and so forth. Saudi Arabia is medieval.
Yes.
There's nothing short of medieval. It's the Wahhabi sect of Islam. There are 4 major sects, and then the Shias are a little different. I think I agree with Tom Friedman. It's a power thing for the royal family. They're scared to do anything that upsets. They made a deal with the conservative mullahs. You know, you let us rule, and we let you do all these peculiar things that you do in terms of interpreting Islam. Iran was certainly that way. It's eased a little bit now and so on. But most Muslim countries aren't that way. So you basically, in my judgment, you know, I mean, Islam, you're talking about political regimes that find it useful for their purposes to do these things to women. And it's outrageous.
What about in Saudi Arabia, U.S. servicewomen serving, you know, that were stationed in Saudi Arabia, if they went off U.S. bases, they used to have to wear abayas.
Yeah, they couldn't drive a car.
Couldn't drive a car. I mean...
But it's absurd. But we go even further. That Tom Friedman has this wonderful article. You've all got to read Latitudes and Attitudes, Longitudes and Attitudes, or something like that. Whatever that guy. I brought it with me. I don't have it with me right now. But he has a wonderful article in the last year or something like that about. You know, he always has a little tug in cheek. He says, you know, it's a terrible thing in Saudi Arabia now because middle-class men have to drive their children and their wives to school and so on because the wives can't drive, and so they're trying to hold down a job and do the driving, and the woman can't help at all, and it results in the man absolutely being dragged. You know, so it sounds like the woman who tries to do everything, keep the house and have a career. You know, I don't want to overdo this, but what an absurd system. Can we impose, coming back to something, we impose and say, okay, Saudi Arabia, we're going to off with your heads, royal family, and, you know, women are going to, no, we can't do that. To be frank with you, even if we wish to, the complexity of the world is such, how valuable is their oil, and and all those kinds of things. And when we intervene and we talk about a war on terrorism and so on, as I think I said last night, if I recall correctly, we have to pick our shots. We don't have the power to go everywhere. In fact, we're hugely stretched at the moment. We have troops in the Philippines, and we have people all over the place doing stuff in small numbers and so on and so forth. So we have to pick very strategically where we go in the hopes that we can create something that will flow out in a wedge and improve things in other places. One of the arguments for going into Iraq, to get to something that's in the news, is that if we were to be successful, in the sense of, boom, he's gone and things have changed, notwithstanding you got Kurds in the north and Sunnis in the middle and the majority is Shias in the south and so on and so forth, and we were able to help with them to have their own, not impose, a democracy, of sorts and so on in there, and it worked, and they have oil, so there'd be money, unlike in Afghanistan, to help with the payments for it and so on and so forth. That would send a huge message to Egypt and some of these other places with repressive regimes, and to the people in their countries who would like to have democracies, that, hey, we got friends. This can work. It isn't hopeless, and so on and so forth. And if we educated people, started having science, Friedman says in some of these schools in Saudi Arabia, the science texts are all 1920s European texts. This is in the year 2000, or 2002, I guess, or whatever it was. How is anybody going to succeed in the real world, if they're learning science, from the 1920s? That's, to me, a no-brainer. So that's the argument. But we can't do very many of those. Now, let me just say one other thing, and this is Mandelbaum's, point. And Mark Johnson, you should chime in here whether you agree or disagree on anything here, because you know much more about this in many ways than I do. The other thing is that, and this is going to sound like imposition, Pax Americana, we are by far the most powerful country in the world, so far. Okay, and just by leaps and bounds, in every way. In every way. We are also, maybe, I don't know whether it's the only, but I haven't thought through history, so maybe somebody else, but we're one of the precious few, if not the only country that has that kind of disproportionate power in relation to everybody else, that hasn't just on taking over things, in the sense of, brute force. We're certainly not Hitler or Stalin moving into Eastern Europe or, or whoever you may want to describe. And that's known around the world, even people who say they don't like us. And so a lot of people, and I'm awfully impressed with Tom Friedman. He says this, and I don't know whether I got it from him. He certainly didn't get it from me. I may have invented it on my own, but I'm not sure. He makes, maybe it wasn't him, but somebody has made the point, in addition to me, that we have, you could argue almost, if we want to have a peaceful world, in which there are fewer rather than more terrorists, no nation state's going to attack us, and we don't have to worry about that. I don't think, at least not in the present context. But if we want a safer world and a more prosperous world, which is for really selfish reasons, Americans can sell things to people, all that kind of stuff. It is in our interest to use our power, in a way that makes the point that strategically, not everywhere, not every place, that there's going to be real trouble if somebody tries to take us on in some major way that is harmful to our interests. That is clearly wrong. I'm not talking about doing it just because we're going to take them over. And I think that the world is a somewhat amoral place, and nation states are certainly amoral by and large. And if you don't use your power from time to time to make the point that you're willing and have the guts to use it. Remember, Osama bin Laden, killed a bunch of people in the first thing at the beginning of the 90s in the World Trade Center. He blew up a bunch of embassies, killed a bunch of people, mostly Africans, but also some Americans. He blew a hole in the USS Cole and killed a bunch of sailors, and so on. And, we fired off some missiles, but we didn't really do anything. Now, it's very hard for America to really do something unless something like the Trade Towers happens, because it was like Pearl Harbor. I mean, more people were lost than Pearl Harbor, actually. But once we get going, we can be pretty tough. And that point, that just physical toughness needs to be a part of the equation in order to give courage to people who might want to be on our side, that if they go forward and try to do something, they won't be totally abandoned. Now, what I've just said is only half true, because one of the things that we haven't done, I'm in favor of using power from time to time. One of the things we haven't done has been very good since the Marshall Plan and Japan. MacArthur was amazing in Japan. Is the kind of difficult, messy stuff of nation building after the war's over, whatever that war may be after that conflict. That is harder to get political support for. Truman was exercised enormous leadership when he did the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. So, but we had a big threat in the Soviets, this, that, and the other thing. Europe, closer to us culturally, easier to do. There were a lot of German Americans, French Americans, and so on and so forth. But now we got all kinds of people. There are plenty of Arab Americans in this country today. I don't know what the percentages are. But I think that I guess I'm going to start with the thing that is absolutely on the table. And I don't think we're doing that great a job of it. I think we need to really be serious. And here, no one's against us. We need to get our allies into it, and they will come if we leave. In Afghanistan, we cannot let the Karzai regime fail. I mean, that is absolutely off the table. Yet we're not putting enough resources into it. We've got to help, just as we help Germany and France and so on recover. Even Afghanistan, a funny country, if it hadn't been for the Taliban and for Osama bin Laden being there, we probably wouldn't be thinking about it. Know that most Americans had ever heard of Kabul before September 11th. But if we do not set the precedent that, hey, America, if you guys make the step and move towards they've had their lawyer Jurger, so on and so forth. They move towards, this democracy business and so on and so forth. We and our friends, Europeans, should be part of this, and anybody else that wants to be part of it, will be there with you to help you get to the point where you can, move off on your own. If we go into Iraq, we absolutely have to be committed to do that. Otherwise, we're going to look like people just go in and do spankings, but don't nurture the child after the spanking is over. I mean, spankings are okay, but you've got to do the other as well.
Let me ask you this.
Yeah.
Building on all of those principles we've talked about, it seems like this proposal is somewhat idealistic. And the reality of this situation is there are some consequences.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the consequences I haven't really heard many speak about are the environmental concerns. We're taking as the premise the United States has an enormous appetite, not only with resource, but with quality of life, with the increasing need for security.
Huge amounts of stuff, if that's where you're heading.
That's where I'm heading. And as a consequence of that consumption, we have issues of global warming, increased chemical and nuclear waste disposal problems, rapid extinction of diversity of species, et cetera, the growing problem of quality of water. And it seems that this homogenization into other parts of the world simply will not sustain. And that we're encouraging a lifestyle that will implode upon itself. And how, in your opinion, obviously, how will we address this? And how can we allow countries to, evolve within our economic model and at the same time address these problems?
I think we need to do a better job on all of that. First of all, on the question of global warming in the first Bush administration, one of the things I did was oversee regulatory review. Just to show you that I have no principle whatsoever. At the beginning of the Nixon administration, I worked for the administrator of EPA and helped write the Clean Air Act, so I've been on both sides of the issue. Scientifically, it is not clear what global warming is and whether we're really on a course towards that. That's not to say that just in case scientifically that turns out to be, it's not proven the other way either.
Yeah, and we surely want to use it.
And it's catastrophic if it in fact is true. So I mean, that's a piece.
Right.
But there are consequences. Now, having said that, the United States, American people, wealthy as we are and so on and so forth, are enormously wasteful. We squander huge amounts of resources. I mean, I had four-wheel drive vehicles in Colorado to go up a mile of private road that you couldn't get up there any other way in the wintertime for sure. But I'm back in Washington now with those vehicles because I haven't gotten around to buying new kinds of vehicles. But I see a lot of SUVs in the parking lot of our apartment building that are absurd. There's no need for an SUV in the center of Washington, well, on the outskirts of Washington, D.C. The administration won't agree with me on this. I think we need to make it more costly for people to indulge their fantasy of being a trucker, or whatever the hell they think they are in these giant vehicles. I mean, maybe in Missoula you might need it, but you do not need it in Northern Virginia under any circumstances. So I'm with you on that. I think industry, since the oil shock in the early 70s, and I headed a group at Commerce Department on Energy Conservation in those days, I think industry has come down. The amount of BTUs consumed per unit of output is considerably less than it used to be, and that was largely non-regulatory, just sort of happened because the cost principles were there. Still, we're viewed as bad in this respect. And when you talk to people in China, and they have the most awful soft coal that just belches stuff out of their smokestacks. You come back from a day of walking around in China and your throat is hoarse and your eyes hurt. It's much worse than Los Angeles or Denver. You wonder how much time comes off people's lives as a result of all of that in China. They make the argument, as do people in Brazil who don't want to do much about preserving the Brazilian rainforest, which has got a lot to do with CO2. They make the argument, hey, you guys went rummaging along in the 19th century and chopped everything down and, belched smoke up into the air and so on, and so now it's our turn. And, you got where you are, and now it's our turn. We're going to have the cheapest possible way. It's hard to have a totally satisfactory argument against that.
Yeah.
I mean, in many ways, particularly if we're going to have SUVs in Northern Virginia. Our point source pollution has come way down. I mean, there are people out there who argue about coal mines anywhere. I mean, we're pretty clean, not totally clean, but fairly clean on a lot of that stuff now environmentally because of regulation. Otherwise, it wouldn't have happened. I think we've got to do a better job of that. Yes, it's going to cost money, but long term, we do need to worry about resources. And now I'm going to show you that I have no fixed position on almost anything. I'll mention something cuts in the opposite direction. I still come out where I did. The thing that cuts in the opposite direction, I can remember in 1980, Gus Speth, who was then the chairman of the Council on Environmental Quality in the Carter administration, had published a report. I don't remember the name of it, but the point was we were running out of this, that, and the other thing. Okay. And I participated in writing a counter report in the Reagan administration that didn't really have a name to it, but it pointed out, Lord Jevons in the 1870s said, the UK was about to run out of coal, and then they found Wales. The reason for my saying that is there's a lot of resources still out there. That's not to say that it is a good thing for us to go and try to use them all up, okay? But it is to say that doom and gloom isn't directly here. But as populations increase, and particularly in the developing world where there's less money to deal with it, it's sort of a little bit like setting the example politically and culturally. We need to set an example on resource use so that we are more credible when arguing with other countries on this matter. The auto companies say that they are now seriously investing in, among other things, a hydrogen economy, which would be nirvana. Water is, as you know here, you got a bit of a drought, but I mean, water is a lot easier to come by than oil, and it's cleaner. So maybe we're going to make progress. While doom and gloom is not at the door, we need to move in the direction you're suggesting.
Is it?
Well, I think we have about an hour format for the
Okay.
program, though I certainly want to thank everyone for coming down and offering all of these questions. And thank you, Mr. Hodsoll, for your time.
Delighted. Thank you. Good questions, good discussion. Thank you. Thank you.